Imagine this. You're having a normal conversation. Nothing dramatic, nothing intense. And then, in a small, almost invisible moment, someone disagrees with you, or corrects you, or questions your decision. Instantly, something shifts inside. It may not even show on your face, but internally, there's movement, a tightening in the chest, a subtle rush of thoughts, an urge to clarify, defend, explain, reposition. You don't experience it as insecurity. You experience it as certainty. You think, that's not accurate, or they don't see the full picture, or I need to fix this. But what if that reaction is not about truth? What if it's about protection? There is a structure inside you that organizes your experience around a central idea. This is who I am. And that structure is constantly scanning for threats. Not physical threats, identity threats. You were not born with a fixed identity. You were born open, responsive, undefined. But as you grew, the world responded to certain behaviors more warmly than others. Maybe you were praised for being intelligent, so you leaned into competence. Maybe you were valued for being calm, so you suppressed emotional intensity. Maybe you were rewarded for being strong, so you avoided vulnerability. Maybe you were accepted when you performed well, so achievement became safety. None of this was conscious. It was adaptive. But adaptation, repeated over time, becomes personality. And personality, reinforced for years, becomes identity. Eventually, you stopped saying, "This works," and started saying, "This is me." That shift is subtle, but powerful. Because once something becomes me, it must be defended. If you identify as capable, being wrong feels destabilizing. If you identify as kind, being selfish feels intolerable. If you identify as independent, needing help feels humiliating. The reaction you feel in conflict is rarely about the event itself. It's about maintaining coherence. The ego, though you may not call it that, is the system responsible for preserving a stable narrative about who you are. It filters memory. It justifies behavior. It minimizes contradictions. It highlights strengths. It hides inconsistencies. Not maliciously, protectively. It wants continuity. It wants solidity. It wants to wake up tomorrow and still recognize itself. And here is the uncomfortable beginning of this journey. Much of what you defend so intensely is not your essence. It is a construction, a structure built from past feedback, fear of rejection, desire for belonging, and the need for stability. The ego never wants you to see that your identity was assembled, because if you see that clearly, a new question appears. If this was built, what exists beneath it? Once an identity is formed, something subtle happens. You stop noticing it. It becomes transparent, automatic, invisible. You no longer think, "I am acting this way because I learned it protects me." You think, "This is just how I am." And that is where the ego becomes powerful. Because the moment identity feels natural, it feels unquestionable. You don't defend it consciously. You defend it instinctively. Notice how quickly you justify yourself when criticized. If someone says you were insensitive, your mind searches for context. If someone says you failed, your mind gathers explanations. If someone questions your motives, your mind builds a case. You call this reasoning, but often it is preservation. The ego does not like gaps in the narrative. It does not tolerate contradictions easily. It wants coherence, a stable storyline. If you see yourself as responsible, you reinterpret laziness as exhaustion. If you see yourself as honest, you reinterpret manipulation as strategy. If you see yourself as independent, you reinterpret avoidance as strength. The goal is not truth. The goal is continuity, and continuity feels like safety. This is why admitting "I was wrong" can feel disproportionately heavy. It is not the mistake that hurts. It is the crack in identity. Because if you were wrong about this, what else might you be wrong about? The ego senses instability in that question, so it resists. It resists through defensiveness, through subtle superiority, through sarcasm, through withdrawal, through blame. Different personalities, same mechanism, protection of the constructed self. And here is something even deeper. The ego does not only defend who you believe you are, it defends who you are afraid not to be. If your value has been built around intelligence, being average feels terrifying. If your worth has been built around strength, being fragile feels unacceptable. If your identity has been built around being needed, being unnecessary feels like erasure. So you overperform, you overexplain, you overcommit, you overcontrol. Not because you are dramatic, but because somewhere inside, your identity is fused with survival. The ego never wants you to notice how much of your energy is spent maintaining a self-image. Because once you see that clearly, something destabilizing happens. You begin to ask, if I am constantly defending this version of myself, who would I be without the defense? There is something the ego does so subtly that you rarely notice it. It convinces you that you are objective, that your reactions are rational, that your judgments are fair, that your interpretations are accurate. But the ego does not show you reality. It shows you reality filtered through identity. And once identity is involved, perception is no longer neutral. Imagine two people giving you the exact same feedback. One you respect, one you secretly compete with. The words are identical, but your reaction is completely different. Why? Because the ego is not reacting to the content. It is reacting to what the content means for your position. The ego is constantly measuring status, relevance, competence, control. It wants to know where you stand in every interaction, above, below, equal. It scans for subtle signals, tone shifts, facial expressions, pauses in conversation, who gets attention, who gets credit. And it interprets everything through a single lens. Does this confirm who I believe I am, or does it threaten it? If it confirms, you relax. If it threatens, you tighten. This is why you can replay a small comment in your head for hours. Not because the comment was devastating, but because it destabilized your narrative. The ego's favorite illusion is this. It makes you believe you are defending truth when you are actually defending position. Position in the social hierarchy, position in moral comparison, position in intellectual standing, position in emotional power. Even silence can feel like defeat. Even being misunderstood can feel like erasure. Even losing an argument can feel like loss of self. But here is what the ego never wants you to realize. Most conflicts are not about facts. They are about identity preservation. If you identify as knowledgeable, disagreement feels like disrespect. If you identify as morally right, opposition feels like corruption. If you identify as emotionally aware, criticism feels like blindness. And because identity is involved, the nervous system reacts. Your body tightens, your voice sharpens, your thinking narrows. You stop listening, you start preparing. Not preparing to understand, preparing to win. Winning restores identity. Losing destabilizes it. This is why even intelligent, self-aware people can become irrational in arguments. The ego does not disappear with education. It simply becomes more sophisticated. It learns to defend itself using logic, using philosophy, using psychological language, using moral justification. But the mechanism remains the same: protection. The ego never wants you to see that many of your strong opinions are emotionally anchored in who you need to be. Because if you saw that clearly, you would begin separating your worth from your position, and that would loosen its grip. The moment you realize you can be wrong and still be intact, the ego loses its favorite illusion. Part that contradicts your preferred identity. If you see yourself as patient, there is impatience somewhere. If you see yourself as generous, there is selfishness somewhere. If you see yourself as honest, there are distortions somewhere. If you see yourself as strong, there is fear somewhere. The ego does not eliminate these traits. It hides them, not because you are fake, but because contradiction threatens coherence. From early on, you learned which parts of you were acceptable and which were not. The acceptable parts were reinforced. The unacceptable parts were suppressed. But suppression is not deletion. What you reject does not disappear. It moves into the background, into what psychology often describes as the shadow, the disowned aspects of yourself. The ego never wants you to look there, because the shadow destabilizes the narrative. If you have built your identity around being morally right, discovering pettiness inside yourself feels disorienting. If you have built your identity around being emotionally mature, noticing envy or insecurity feels humiliating. If you have built your identity around being different from those people, recognizing similarity feels threatening. So instead of integrating these traits, the ego projects them. The arrogance you deny in yourself becomes intolerable in others. The neediness you suppress becomes irritating when someone else expresses it. The manipulation you rationalize becomes outrageous when you witness it externally. Projection protects identity. It says, "That flaw is not mine." But strong emotional reactions are rarely random. If someone triggers you intensely, there is often resonance. Not necessarily identical behavior, but a shared psychological root. The ego does not want you to explore that resonance, because exploration requires humility, and humility softens superiority. Without superiority, even subtle, quiet superiority, identity loses one of its stabilizers. This is why self-awareness is uncomfortable, not because you are discovering that you are terrible, but because you are discovering that you are complex. You are not purely what you present. You are a spectrum, capable of contradiction, capable of light and shadow. The ego prefers simplicity. It prefers clear labels, good or bad, strong or weak, aware or ignorant. But reality is layered, and the moment you begin acknowledging your shadow, not judging it, not indulging it, but recognizing it, something shifts. You become less reactive, less threatened by others' flaws, less invested in appearing consistent, because you are no longer fighting parts of yourself in the external world. The ego never wants you to see your shadow clearly, because once you do, you stop defending a myth of perfection and start inhabiting something more stable, psychological wholeness. There is a specific kind of tiredness that has nothing to do with sleep. It doesn't come from physical effort. It doesn't come from dramatic suffering. It comes from maintenance, maintaining an image, maintaining consistency, maintaining control over how you are perceived. When identity becomes something you must constantly defend, your nervous system never fully rests. Even in ordinary moments, part of you is monitoring. How did that sound? Did I appear competent? Was that too much? Did I look insecure? Did they notice the hesitation? This silent scanning runs in the background of your life, and it consumes energy. You might not call it ego. You might call it professionalism, maturity, social awareness, self-improvement. But look closely. How often do you adjust your tone not to communicate clearly, but to protect your image? How often do you hesitate to admit ignorance because you're known as the capable one? How often do you suppress emotion because you're known as the stable one? The more defined your identity becomes, the more effort it requires to sustain it. If you are the strong one, you cannot fall apart easily. If you are the smart one, you cannot misunderstand publicly. If you are the independent one, you cannot need reassurance openly. So you perform coherence, not dramatically, subtly. And over time, that subtle performance becomes exhausting. You smile when you are irritated. You agree when you disagree. You overwork to maintain competence. You avoid vulnerability to preserve strength. This creates an internal split. Externally, you appear consistent. Internally, you feel fragmented. Part of you wants to rest. Another part insists on maintaining the standard. And here is the deeper layer. The ego equates letting go of the image with losing value. If I stop being the strong one, will I still be respected? If I stop being the agreeable one, will I still be loved? If I stop being exceptional, will I still matter? So you continue. You maintain, you optimize, you refine. But exhaustion becomes information, because maintaining a rigid identity requires constant vigilance, and vigilance is not peace. The ego never wants you to notice how much energy is spent protecting who you think you must be. Because if you saw that clearly, you might experiment. You might let yourself be inconsistent. You might allow yourself to be misunderstood. You might admit you don't know. You might disappoint someone. And the moment you do that, and survive, something radical happens. You realize that identity is not as fragile as the ego insisted. And that realization begins to loosen its grip. There is a moment that almost no one talks about. It happens when you begin to see the ego clearly. At first, it feels empowering. You notice your defensiveness. You recognize your need to be right. You observe your subtle superiority or your hidden inferiority. You start catching the moments where you are protecting an image instead of responding to reality. But then something unexpected appears. Fear. Not loud fear, not panic, a quiet instability. Because if you are not the image you defend, who are you? The ego never wants you to stay with that question. It prefers quick replacement. If you stop identifying as the intelligent one, it wants you to become the humble one. If you stop identifying as the strong one, it wants you to become the healed one. If you stop identifying as the victim, it wants you to become the empowered one. Notice the pattern. The ego does not mind transformation. It minds dissolution. It is comfortable changing costumes. It is uncomfortable disappearing from center stage. So even spiritual growth can become identity. Self-awareness can become superiority. Humility can become performance. You can start saying, "I have no ego," while subtly building a new one. This is why the work becomes more refined at this stage. It is no longer about correcting behavior. It is about noticing attachment. Attachment to being right. Attachment to being seen as evolving. Attachment to being different. Attachment to being misunderstood. Attachment to being exceptional, even in your suffering. The ego survives through attachment, and attachment creates tension. You can feel it in arguments where you don't actually care about the outcome, but care deeply about not losing. You can feel it in conversations where silence would be enough, but you need the last word. You can feel it when someone does not recognize your effort and something inside tightens. That tightening is not about truth. It is about identity dissolving. The ego interprets dissolution as death, but psychologically, dissolution is expansion. When you stop clinging to a fixed image, you do not disappear. You become fluid. You can be intelligent without needing to prove it, strong without needing to display it, compassionate without needing recognition, wrong without collapsing. But the transition feels unstable because the ego equates stability with rigidity. In reality, rigidity breaks. Fluidity adapts. The fear you feel when identity softens is not a sign that you are losing yourself. It is a sign that you are loosening what was never fully you to begin with. And this is the threshold. The ego will fight hardest here. Not with drama, with subtle whispers. Be careful. Don't lose yourself. If you let go, people won't respect you. You'll become weak. But what it is truly afraid of is this. If you no longer need to defend who you are, it no longer controls the narrative. And that is the beginning of real psychological freedom. There is a specific moment in inner transformation that changes everything. It is not dramatic. It is not mystical. It is not visible from the outside. It is the first time you see your ego in action and do not immediately obey it. You are in a conversation. Someone disagrees. You feel the familiar tightening, the urge to interrupt, to defend, to clarify your superiority, your intention, your correctness. But this time, something different happens. You notice it, not after, not hours later, in the moment. You see the reaction forming, and instead of following it automatically, you pause. That pause is small, but psychologically, it is enormous. Because for the first time, you are not fused with the reaction. You are observing it. And in that observation, a question appears. What exactly am I protecting right now? Not what argument, not what idea, but what image? Is it the image of being intelligent, of being morally right, of being emotionally mature, of being superior, of being the one who never fails? If you are honest enough, the answer is usually clear. You are protecting an identity. And here is where the real work begins. Because once you see that you are defending an image, you have a choice. You can continue defending it, or you can let it soften. Letting it soften does not mean admitting you are wrong when you are not. It does not mean becoming passive or submissive. It means separating your worth from your position. You can hold an opinion without being it. You can receive feedback without collapsing. You can lose an argument without losing yourself. But this requires something the ego resists deeply: humility. Not humiliation, humility. Humility is the recognition that you are larger than any single identity you have constructed, that you are capable of contradiction without disintegration, that you can be intelligent and ignorant in different contexts, strong and afraid in the same week, confident and insecure in the same conversation. The ego fears contradiction. Awareness integrates it. And something surprising happens when you stop defending so intensely. Conversations become lighter. You listen more fully. You react less quickly. Silence no longer feels like defeat. You don't need to win every exchange to feel intact. There is space. And in that space, something subtle emerges. Stability. Not the rigid stability of a fixed identity, but the grounded stability of awareness. You begin to realize that the self-image you were protecting was never your foundation. It was a structure built on top of something deeper. And that deeper layer, the one that observes, notices, reflects, does not need to prove anything. The ego never wanted you to discover that you can exist without constant self-defense. Because once you experience that even once, even briefly, you understand something irreversible. You are not the voice insisting. You are the one who can see it. And that changes the direction of your inner life permanently. There is a quiet shift that happens when you stop fighting your ego and start seeing it clearly. You don't become passive. You don't lose ambition. You don't erase your personality. What changes is something more fundamental. You no longer experience every disagreement as a threat. You no longer interpret every criticism as an attack. You no longer feel compelled to defend every imperfection. Because your identity is no longer fused with your reactions. The ego still speaks. It still prefers comfort. It still seeks validation. It still wants to be right, admired, secure. But now, there is space between the impulse and the action. And that space changes everything. When someone challenges you, you notice the tightening, but you don't immediately obey it. When someone succeeds, you notice the comparison, but you don't collapse into it. When you make a mistake, you notice the urge to justify, but you allow responsibility instead. This is not weakness, it is psychological maturity. The ego survives on unconscious identification. It loses strength when it is observed. And here is the most important realization of all. You do not need to destroy the ego to be free from it. You only need to stop confusing it with who you are. The ego is a tool, an organizing structure, a necessary interface with the world, but it was never meant to be your master. When it dominates, life becomes defensive, comparative, exhausting, rigid. When it softens, life becomes responsive, curious, grounded, fluid. You can hold strong opinions without hostility. You can admit ignorance without shame. You can change without feeling inconsistent. You can evolve without announcing it. And something surprising happens when identity loosens. You become more authentic, not because you perform authenticity, but because you are no longer protecting a fixed image. You don't need to appear strong to feel strong. You don't need to appear intelligent to trust your mind. You don't need to appear evolved to continue growing. There is less noise internally, less narrative, less constant self-positioning. And in that quiet, you begin to experience something rare. Freedom from the compulsion to defend yourself at all times. The ego never wanted you to see that you are not the image you maintain. It never wanted you to realize that awareness is deeper than identity. Because once you see that clearly, even briefly, the illusion of solidity dissolves. You are no longer trapped inside a single version of yourself. You become adaptable without losing integrity, confident without needing superiority, humble without diminishing yourself, present without performing. And perhaps the most liberating shift of all is this. You stop asking, "How do I protect who I am?" and start asking, "What is true right now?" That question cuts through narrative. It cuts through comparison. It cuts through defense. It brings you back to direct experience. And in that space, without image, without performance, without constant self-justification, you discover something the ego tried to hide from you. You were never the structure. You were always the awareness behind it. And awareness does not need to defend itself to exist. It simply sees. And in seeing clearly, you are finally free.